The summer sun still shimmered across the Rio Grande when 15-year-old Isabella Morales promised her mother she'd be home before dinner. She wore a mint green t-shirt, carried a small backpack stuffed with snacks, and flashed a smile as bright as the desert sky. But by dusk, her family's old Ford Ranger sat abandoned in a dusty lot, door wide open, keys still in the ignition, phone glowing with unanswered calls. Imagine it. Your little sister doesn't come home. You dial and dial, but the ringing becomes a cruel metronome. You drive the familiar route, heart pounding, and there it is, the truck, silent, waiting, empty. The desert doesn't answer back. That night, Albuquerque transformed. Patrol cars swept the riverbank, flashlights cutting through brush, helicopters circling overhead. Teenagers with trembling hands called Izzy's name into the darkness. You know the feeling when your safe place, the path you've walked 100 times, suddenly feels like a corridor of shadows? That's what the city lived through. At dawn, 2 miles from the lot, the desert gave up its secret. Drag marks in the sand. A scrap of fabric fluttering on a low branch. And the body of a child who had fought with every ounce of breath she had. She left behind the only voice the killer couldn't silence. The DNA trapped beneath her fingernails. But days turned into weeks, weeks into years. Leads collapsed, suspects faded, and the case was pushed into that quiet, suffocating drawer we call cold case files. 17 years later, science would whisper the name her killer thought he had buried. But justice, when it finally arrived, would come in a way no one expected. And that's where we begin. Stay with us. Subscribe now, tap the bell, and share this story, because Isabella's fight deserves more than silence. Justice may be late, but it must never be forgotten. The morning of July 14th, 2007 began like any other in the Morales household. The air shimmered with the heavy heat that only a New Mexico summer can carry. The Rio Grande, not far from their modest home, whispered through its banks as if unaware it was about to become the backdrop to a family's nightmare. Inside the kitchen, Carmen Morales cracked eggs into a skillet while her teenage children traded light-hearted barbs across the breakfast table. Isabella, or Izzy as her family called her, was bright-eyed and restless with excitement. She had planned a small picnic with friends. Nothing unusual, no alarm bells. She slipped into her favorite mint green t-shirt, tied her long dark hair into a neat ponytail, and packed a backpack with snacks she probably wouldn't finish. Diego, her older brother, teased her, "You're taking enough food for an army." She just laughed, rolled her eyes, and hugged her mom before heading toward the family's aging Ford Ranger. Carmen reminded her, "Be back before the sun gets too low." Eights. Izzy turned at the doorway and waved. That image, her bright smile framed by the rising sun, would become the last memory her mother would ever carry of her alive. You know that feeling? The casual goodbye you barely register, because you think there will always be another one. That's what Carmen replayed in her mind for years afterward. A simple wave, a mint green shirt, and then silence. By late afternoon, the golden-orange light stretched across Albuquerque. At the Morales home, dinner plates clinked. The seat meant for Isabella stayed empty. Carmen dialed her daughter's cell phone, expecting to hear the familiar ringtone and Izzy's cheerful, "I'm on my way." Instead, the call rang out into emptiness. Again and again. Diego joined in, his voice steady at first, then breaking as every attempt fell flat. Hours passed. The unease grew heavier, settling like lead in Carmen's chest. You've felt it before, that creeping intuition that something isn't just delayed, it's wrong. Parents know the difference between disobedience and danger. Carmen knew. At dusk, Diego grabbed his car keys. "I'll drive the trail route," he told his mom, trying to sound calm but already shaking. The Rio Grande trails were familiar territory. Families picnicked there. Joggers passed daily. Fishermen cast lines at the riverbank. But this time, the road stretched longer, lonelier. And then he saw it. The family's Ford Ranger sat in an empty parking lot, dust swirling faintly in the desert wind. The driver's door was wide open. The keys dangled in the ignition. On the passenger seat, Izzy's phone glowed with missed calls, Carmen's number repeating like an unanswered prayer. No footprints leading away. No skid marks. No blood. Just a silence so total it crushed Diego's chest. He dialed the police with trembling hands, his words cracking into static. When officers arrived minutes later, the lot became a theater of unanswered questions. They secured the scene, shining flashlights into every crevice of the truck, photographing the ignition, bagging the cell phone. The sun dipped fully, leaving only red and blue lights splashed against desert scrub. Carmen arrived soon after, collapsing into her neighbor's arms, screaming her daughter's name into the night air. This was no teenage runaway. Izzy wasn't the kind to vanish without a word. She wasn't the kind to throw away her phone or leave her family guessing. Everyone knew that, which made the emptiness of that truck even more terrifying. By midnight, the search expanded. K-9 units sniffed through brush. Helicopters buzzed overhead with infrared cameras scanning for heat signatures. Volunteers, some barely older than Izzy herself, lined up shoulder to shoulder, sweeping flashlights across dry grass and tangled undergrowth. Their voices broke as they called her name into the darkness. Imagine being 15, clutching a flashlight, terrified but refusing to go home until your friend is found. That was the scene along the Rio Grande that night. A line of trembling teenagers fighting back tears, trying to pierce the black desert silence. For every parent in Albuquerque, the realization landed hard. This wasn't just the Morales family's tragedy. It was a warning. If it could happen to Izzy, it could happen to anyone's child. Doors were locked tighter. Neighbors kept closer watch. The Rio Grande, once a place for fishing trips and family picnics, became a scarred landscape. And yet, through all the chaos, the sirens, the shouts, the whirring helicopters, the most haunting sound was the absence of one voice. Izzy's. You can imagine Carmen at home that night, clutching the phone as if it were a lifeline, leaving tearful voicemails that would never be answered. "Izzy, please, just pick up. Just say something." Each unanswered ring broke her a little more. By dawn, the city was wide awake with fear. Patrol cars, news vans, and volunteers crowded the trailhead. The Morales family's private nightmare had become Albuquerque's collective dread. The unanswered questions piled up like sand in the desert wind. Where did she go? Who took her? And why? But no answers came. Not then, not for weeks, and eventually, not for years. The truck with the open door and the glowing phone would mark the start of one of New Mexico's most haunting stories, destined to sink into the archives of cold case files until, many years later, science would rewrite its ending. If you've stayed with us this far, it means Izzy's story matters to you. Help us keep her memory alive. If you think this video is compelling, comment 1 below. If you don't, comment 0. Your voice helps us know which cases to tell, and it ensures Isabella Morales will not be forgotten. The night along the Rio Grande was long, restless, and brutal. Hours of searching turned into a blur of flashlights bobbing through the brush, radio static crackling through the humid air, and exhausted voices calling out a single name. Izzy! For Carmen Morales, each unanswered echo felt like a hammer blow against her chest. She sat in her living room, clutching the phone, praying that any second it would ring with news. Good news? Diego, hoarse from shouting, refused to stop sweeping the trails with volunteers. Hope had not yet burned out. But when the first gray light crept across the Sandia Mountains on July 15th, 2007, exhaustion began to weigh heavier than optimism. K-9 units panted, tails low, their handlers exchanging uneasy glances. Even seasoned deputies admitted what they feared. As the hours ticked by, the chance of finding Isabella alive shrank by the minute. Then, just after 8, E0A, M. A group of volunteers fanned out along a dry arroyo, a shallow creek bed carved into the desert floor less than 2 miles from the parking lot where Izzy's truck had been found. The arroyo, quiet and deceptively ordinary, carried a faint dampness from rain 2 nights earlier. One man slowed his pace. The sand seemed off, smooth in places, yet scuffed by strange impressions, as if something or someone had been dragged across it. He raised his flashlight, signaling the others. Over here! 8s! Deputies rushed in. Yellow tape unfurled. Cameras clicked. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't hopeful. It was heavy, suffocating, and final. Face down, half buried in wet sand, lay the body of Isabella Morales. Her long black hair was matted with grit. Her mint green t-shirt had slipped from one shoulder. Scratches covered her hands, her fingernails broken and caked with dirt. Bruises marked her wrists and knees. She had fought desperately, until the desert itself had been forced into her lungs. You imagine it, don't you? Kneeling in sand, fighting to breathe, clawing at anything that might keep you alive. That's what Isabella endured in her final moments. And when you picture it, you understand why investigators later said her body was not just a victim. It was a message, a testimony that refused to be silenced. A young forensic technician couldn't hold back tears when she spotted a colorful woven bracelet still clinging to Izzy's wrist. It was a gift from a classmate, something she never took off. That bracelet became the most human, heartbreaking detail at the scene. It was a reminder that this wasn't just evidence. It was a child. Around her, investigators documented every fragment of the story the arroyo held. The drag marks suggested she'd been forced down the path. A shoe print, a man's, much larger than Isabella's foot, stood out a few feet away. Technicians crouched over it, photographing, measuring, casting it before the desert wind could erase it. Nearby, a torn scrap of dark fabric fluttered from a low branch. Every detail mattered. Every detail had to be preserved, because the killer had been careful, but not careful enough. The sheriff ordered an immediate aerial survey. From above, FBI helicopters photographed the layout of the arroyo, the drag marks, the clusters of footprints. Investigators began to piece together a chilling theory. Isabella had likely been subdued near the parking lot, led or forced along the trail, and brought into the arroyo where the final, violent struggle ended her life. For Carmen, the news came like a lightning strike. When deputies arrived at her doorstep, their faces somber, she already knew. A mother's heart can feel the truth before the words are spoken. She collapsed in sobs, screaming her daughter's name. Diego, standing beside her, clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. He would later say that, in that moment, he felt 2 things at once: a crushing grief and a burning rage that no one had been there to protect his sister. Back at the arroyo, the scene was clinical yet devastating. Forensic teams moved methodically, bagging evidence, scraping beneath Isabella's fingernails for foreign material, DNA that might belong to her attacker. They cut fibers from her clothing, sealed the bracelet, lifted soil samples from beneath her body. Every step was documented, because investigators knew they had only one chance to capture what the desert had left behind. No sexual assault was evident, but the bruises told their own story. The pattern on her wrists indicated she had been gripped tightly, restrained. Her knees bore deep abrasions, suggesting she had been forced down. The sand in her lungs told the final truth. She had been pressed face first into the earth until she suffocated. Even seasoned officers whispered to each other that this scene would haunt them forever. You've probably seen crime shows, where discoveries like this are wrapped neatly into an hour of drama. But real life is different. Real life leaves you staring at the ground, wondering how a child's final breath can vanish into sand without anyone hearing it. Real life leaves families with decades of questions, waiting for a system to catch up. That's why stories like Isabella's end up in the archives of cold case files, because justice is often too slow, and silence lasts too long. By noon, the coroner's van pulled away. The white sheet covering Isabella's small frame seemed unbearable against the desert sun. Onlookers bowed their heads. A veteran deputy whispered, "She fought to her last breath. We'll make sure her voice is heard." Eights. News traveled fast. Local headlines screamed. Missing teen's body found in Rio Grande Arroyo. Albuquerque froze. Parents clutched their children tighter. Neighbors avoided eye contact, as if acknowledging the horror aloud would make it real. The community's trust cracked overnight. A place once known for its quiet river trails now carried a reputation for danger and loss. At the Morales home, grief unfolded in waves. Carmen spent hours staring at Izzy's empty room, touching her clothes, inhaling the faint scent of her perfume. Diego punched walls, cried into his pillow, then forced himself to read every police update like he could will justice into existence. They weren't just mourning, they were preparing for a fight. And it would be a long one. The discovery of Isabella's body was only the beginning. The search for who had done this would stretch across suspects, interrogations, false leads, and years of waiting. A waiting that nearly swallowed the Morales family whole. But for now, on that sweltering July day, the family's world collapsed. The only thing they could hold on to was the hope that the evidence gathered in that arroyo would one day point to a name, and that name would face justice. If Isabella's story has gripped you so far, don't let it fade. Help us keep her memory alive. If you find this video powerful, comment 1 below. If you don't, comment 0. Your feedback tells us which stories to bring out of the shadows and ensures voices like Izzy's are never lost in silence. The morning of July 15th, 2007, was seared into the collective memory of Albuquerque. News of Isabella Morales' body being found in a dry arroyo had already rippled through the city, but for investigators, the work was only beginning. Evidence was fragile, time-sensitive, and every detail mattered. The coroner's van carried Isabella's body away from the desert, leaving behind shaken officers and grieving neighbors who had gathered at the scene. At the Bernalillo County Medical Examiner's office, the weight of the case fell squarely on Dr. Harold Kim, a seasoned forensic pathologist who had spent years unraveling mysteries left behind by the dead. Yet, when Isabella's body was wheeled into the cold, sterile autopsy suite, even he paused. Before him lay the fragile form of a 15-year-old girl whose life had been extinguished in brutal silence. Under the harsh neon lights, technicians prepared the room. Cameras clicked into place, rulers were set for scale, and each instrument gleamed under steel trays. Everything would be documented. The girl was dressed as she had been found, her mint green t-shirt askew, jeans caked in dirt, long hair matted with sand. Beside her lay a woven friendship bracelet, bright against the somber palette of death. To Dr. Kim, it was a reminder that she was not just evidence, but a teenager who had laughed, dreamed, and loved only days earlier. The external examination began. Bruises marked Isabella's wrists, consistent with forceful restraint. Her knees were scraped, skin abraded, as though she had been pushed down or forced onto rough ground. Fingernails were broken, and the undersides revealed embedded fragments, tiny specks of skin and foreign material. These samples, carefully collected and sealed, would become the most valuable voice Isabella had left behind. The turning point came when Dr. Kim turned to the lungs. Slicing tissue samples, he found what searchers at the Arroyo already suspected. The girl had suffocated. Within the alveoli were fine grains of sand and traces of damp earth. She had been forced face down, alive, until her lungs filled with mud and grit. The suffocation was not an accident. It was homicide, deliberate and cruel. Isabella's lungs had recorded her final moments with devastating clarity. Hours passed as every injury was catalogued. No signs of sexual assault were present, but restraint and physical struggle were undeniable. The bruising pattern indicated that someone had gripped her tightly, compressing delicate tissue at the wrists and inner arms. The scratches across her forearms suggested desperate attempts to break free. Defensive wounds whispered of a fight that was hopeless from the start, yet one she had refused to give up. Technicians swabbed her torn shirt and jeans for trace evidence. Microscopic fibers, human hairs, and skin cells might tell the story her voice no longer could. Each item was bagged, labeled, and preserved. Isabella's bracelet was removed and sealed as well. It might have brushed against her killer's skin in those final moments, capturing fragments invisible to the eye. By the time the autopsy concluded, the team had built a narrative from bruises, scratches, and grains of sand. Isabella Morales had not run away. She had not fallen victim to misadventure. She had been attacked, restrained, and suffocated. Her body had become a silent witness, carrying within it both the story of her struggle and the potential identity of her killer. The preliminary report delivered to investigators was sobering. Cause of death, mechanical asphyxiation. Manner of death, homicide. Critical evidence included bruising patterns, broken nails, foreign DNA, and soil samples. For the Morales family, still reeling from the discovery of her body, the clinical words carried unbearable weight. A mother heard confirmation that her daughter had fought for her life. A brother saw written proof that she had resisted until her final breath. Yet, as powerful as the findings were, they presented both hope and frustration. The DNA extracted from beneath Isabella's fingernails was precious, but in 2007, databases were limited. When uploaded to CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, no matches were returned. The killer had not been arrested before. He was not in the system. What could have been the sharpest spear of justice was, at the time, only a fragment waiting for future science to sharpen it. Investigators knew they faced a long, uphill battle. The shoe print found near the Arroyo was photographed and compared to databases of common footwear patterns. The dark scrap of fabric recovered from a low branch was sent for fiber analysis. But each lead opened only to dead ends. No immediate suspect emerged, and without a match to the DNA, police were left circling possibilities in the dark. Forensic experts often refer to the body as the first witness, and Isabella's autopsy lived up to that creed. Her lungs had told the story of suffocation. Her bruises had revealed restraint. Her fingernails had delivered a clue powerful enough to one day name her killer. The question was when. As weeks passed, the initial fire of the investigation dimmed. Police had exhausted the obvious suspects, tested their DNA, and eliminated them one by one. The case files grew thicker, filled with interviews, lab reports, and photographs, but no breakthrough. In newsrooms across New Mexico, Isabella's story slipped slowly from front-page headlines to smaller sections, grouped with other unsolved crimes. Behind the scenes, however, the Morales case was never forgotten. Investigators kept returning to the DNA, aware that it might take years for the right technology, or the killer's next mistake, to reveal his name. Each time the file was reopened, they revisited the same photographs. The Arroyo's sand, the shoe print, the torn t-shirt. They reread Dr. Kim's autopsy report, reminded that the victim herself had left behind the most damning testimony. That is why, when the case was eventually shelved as a cold case in 2010, it carried a different weight. It was not abandonment, but a reluctant pause, forced by the limitations of science at the time. The label Cold Case Files placed on Isabella's tragedy was both a sentence of delay and a promise of possibility. It meant the evidence would remain preserved, waiting for a day when forensic tools could amplify her silent voice into something undeniable. For the Morales family, however, scientific progress was little comfort. They wanted answers in 2007, not a decade later. To them, the autopsy was confirmation of horror without resolution. Yet within those clinical reports and carefully sealed bags of evidence lay the seeds of justice, seeds that would take over a decade to bloom. The autopsy confirmed what investigators already feared. Isabella Morales had been murdered. The evidence told a brutal story of restraint, suffocation, and a desperate fight for survival. But the biggest question remained, who did it? The Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office wasted no time. Within days, they began compiling a list of people connected to Isabella, both near and far. The first logical step was the familiar circle: friends, classmates, neighbors, and anyone who might have seen her on the day she vanished. Isabella's ex-boyfriend, Miguel Alvarez, was at the top of that list. He was 16, a year older than Isabella, and their relationship had ended quietly a few months earlier. Police knew that teenage emotions could turn volatile. They brought him in, not once, but twice. Under the fluorescent glare of the interrogation room, Miguel insisted he was playing basketball with friends that afternoon. At first, it sounded like an easy alibi, something anyone could claim. But his friends confirmed it, and grainy footage from a public park camera backed him up. When investigators collected Miguel's DNA, you can imagine the tension. Every detective in that room knew that a single match beneath Isabella's fingernails could crack the case wide open. But the results came back negative. Miguel's DNA wasn't there. He was released, though the shadow of suspicion lingered in the community. Even teenagers whispered in hallways, some calling him guilty, others convinced he had been framed. For Miguel, the weight of suspicion was heavy enough that he eventually transferred schools. Then came the neighbors. People who lived close to the Morales family became subjects of scrutiny, because statistics often show that predators aren't strangers, they're nearby, hidden in plain sight. One man, Carl Benson, drew particular interest. A solitary bachelor in his 40s, Benson had been reported years earlier for staring at young women in a park. When questioned, he appeared nervous, shifting in his seat, hands sweating. He claimed he had been home watching baseball on July 14th. No one could directly confirm his story. For a moment, suspicion seemed justified. Then came the lab results. His DNA didn't match either. Just like that, another lead collapsed. And once the media got wind of his name, neighbors whispered even louder. Innocent or not, his reputation never recovered. But the most unsettling figure was Richard Gutierrez, a man with a record. In 2003, he had been arrested for harassing a student near downtown Albuquerque. Though the charges never stuck, his history painted him in a suspicious light. When detectives asked where he was on the evening of Isabella's disappearance, his answers shifted. First he said he was home all night. Then he changed his story, claiming he had visited a friend in South Valley. That kind of contradiction is gasoline for investigators. It fuels suspicion instantly. A search of his home turned up shoes that looked similar to the print near the arroyo. For a few days, the media exploded. Headlines read, "Isabella's killer found." Neighbors whispered, convinced the nightmare was over. But the lab crushed those hopes. The shoe print was similar in size, but the tread was entirely different. And, once again, the DNA didn't match. Gutierrez was released. For you, as a viewer watching this unfold, imagine the frustration. Each time hope swelled, it was ripped away. Each time a suspect's name hit the evening news, it ended with disappointment. It was a rhythm of rising and crashing that took a toll not only on investigators, but also on Isabella's family. Carmen, her mother, sat through every police briefing. Each time, she held her breath as officers discussed new suspects, only to collapse in tears when the DNA results came back negative. Her son Diego carried his own torment. He clung to the hope that the DNA under his sister's nails was her last act of resistance, a final message pointing toward her killer. But weeks turned into months, and that message remained undeciphered. By late 2007, frustration was boiling over. At community meetings, parents stood up, demanding answers. Why had no one been arrested? Why did every lead fizzle into dust? In neighborhoods that once let kids roam freely, doors were locked tight, curfews set early. The city lived under a shadow of fear. For the investigators, the reality was harsher. Every lead had been tested, every suspect eliminated. The DNA profile was uploaded into CODIS repeatedly, yet each search came back with the same message. No match found. It was like holding the answer to a riddle in your hand, but never being able to speak it aloud. And this is where the cruel nature of cases like Isabella's becomes clear. Despite the most advanced efforts available at the time, technology was still limited. DNA could rule suspects out, but without a match in the system, it could not reveal the killer. What remained was an endless loop of interviews, dead ends, and unanswered questions. For the Morales family, it was agony. Carmen refused to let Isabella's room be touched, keeping it frozen in time. Diego abandoned plans for college, staying home to care for his mother. Every July 14th, they lit candles at Old Town Plaza, begging the community not to forget. Yet, as months turned to years, attendance dwindled. By 2010, the inevitable happened. The sheriff's office issued a statement. Insufficient actionable evidence. Isabella's file was moved to the shelves of the cold case unit. Her name joined hundreds of others, reduced to a label, cold case files. For her family, it was a cruel confirmation of what they feared most. The system had given up. Imagine being Diego, staring at the binder that contained every note, every photograph, every detail of his sister's stolen life, and knowing it was no longer an active case. The weight of that reality is crushing. But there was another layer, the erosion of trust. Many in Albuquerque whispered that law enforcement had failed. Why weren't the shoe prints analyzed better? Why hadn't the fabric scrap produced more leads? Why was the DNA not enough? The questions turned into anger, and anger turned into silence. For years, Isabella's case lived not in headlines, but in the quiet corners of grief. Still, the family clung to ritual. Each vigil, each candle, each photograph of Isabella's smiling face became their protest against forgetting. Her story might have faded in the public eye, but for Carmen and Diego, it never left the center of their lives. This is the cruel paradox of cold cases. Evidence exists, sometimes even powerful evidence, but the tools to unlock it are missing. It's not until science advances that the dead can speak fully. For Isabella Morales, her first voice had come through the autopsy. But her second voice, the one that would name her killer, was still locked in silence. And as you sit with this story, you can feel the weight of that silence. The chill of a case going cold is not just about the passage of time, it's about the loss of momentum, the fading of urgency, the feeling that justice is slipping further out of reach. Yet, the evidence remained, waiting. 17 years would pass before science cracked open that silence. If you've followed Isabella's story so far, you know how heartbreaking it is when hope collides with dead ends. Cases like these remind us why perseverance matters. If you believe stories like this must be told, let us know in the comments. Type 1 if you think this video sheds light on forgotten victims, or 0 if you feel it missed the mark. When Isabella's case was officially placed into cold case files in 2010, it felt like a quiet burial of its own. The folder, thick with photographs, autopsy reports, and lab results, was moved from the active investigation desk to the dim shelves of cases that had stalled. For detectives, it was procedure. For the Morales family, it was a life sentence of unanswered questions. Carmen Morales refused to let her daughter's memory sink into silence. Each year, on July 14th, she stood at Old Town Plaza in Albuquerque, holding a single candle. The first vigil drew hundreds, classmates, neighbors, teachers, even strangers who had followed the news. Dozens of candles flickered across the square, their flames trembling in the desert wind. The plaza glowed with grief and solidarity. But as years slipped by, attendance dwindled. What began as hundreds of flames became dozens, then only a handful. By the 7th anniversary, Carmen found herself lighting the candles almost alone, with Diego at her side. The world had moved on, but the family could not. The ritual, however, was more than grief. It was defiance. Each candle was a protest against forgetting, a small fire challenging the cold weight of the words cold case files. Carmen often told those who gathered, as long as one candle burns, Isabella's voice still speaks. For Diego, the vigils hardened into a vow. He left college, stayed with his mother, and took on the role of guardian of memory. His life's path was reshaped by the absence of justice. The cost of waiting revealed itself in every detail of their lives. Carmen kept Isabella's room untouched. Clothes were still folded neatly in drawers, textbooks stacked on the desk, perfume bottles lined up as though their owner might return any day. She washed her daughter's clothes again and again, smoothing out wrinkles, folding them with trembling hands. To outsiders, it looked like denial. To Carmen, it was survival. Diego bore his pain differently. At night, he sat at Isabella's desk, leafing through her diary. The last entry stopped mid-sentence. Going on a picnic tomorrow? It'll be fun. For years, he stared at those words, imagining what her tomorrow might have been. He whispered her name to the stars, believing that somewhere she could hear him. The strain of waiting was not only personal, it rippled through the wider community. Each year, news outlets ran short features on the anniversary, often placing Isabella's face alongside other unresolved cases. Her name became a symbol, shorthand for the failures and limitations of a system that had let too many families down. When the phrase cold case files appeared on television screens, her photograph was often there, reminding New Mexico that justice was incomplete. Carmen's grief sometimes turned to anger. She spoke at town meetings, confronting officers with blunt questions. "What have you done with my daughter's DNA? Why haven't you found him?" Police responded with technical explanations about limited technology, insufficient data, or lack of matches. To Carmen, they sounded like excuses. Each unsatisfactory answer deepened her mistrust of the system. Yet, despite the frustration, the family kept their vigil. The plaza, the candles, the portrait of Isabella smiling brightly, all became part of Albuquerque's memory. Some years, old classmates returned, bringing flowers or small notes. Other years, only Carmen and Diego stood in the square, their flames lonely against the dark. But the act itself mattered. Each flickering candle was a refusal to surrender to the cold. 12 years passed this way. 12 years of ceremonies where grief was public yet painfully private. 12 years in which Carmen aged rapidly under the weight of sorrow, her once bright spirit dulled by endless waiting. 12 years in which Diego gave up the chance for a different life, tethered by loyalty and loss. The cost of waiting was visible not only in their faces, but in the entire community's perception of justice. Albuquerque residents whispered that if the system could not protect a bright, innocent girl like Isabella, perhaps it could not protect anyone. Parents set stricter curfews, neighbors locked their doors earlier, and a sense of vulnerability seeped into daily life. But even in that darkness, a faint ember of hope endured. Technology was advancing. Stories of other cases solved years later began to appear in the news. Across the country, cold case files were being reopened with new DNA methods, and killers once thought untouchable were being unmasked. Carmen clipped every article, folded it carefully, and tucked it into Isabella's folder. Diego watched with cautious optimism, believing that one day his sister's evidence might finally speak again. For 12 years, the candles burned, the plaza glowed, and the Morales family carried the unbearable weight of waiting. It was a lesson in persistence, but also in the devastating human cost of justice delayed. When the case was finally reopened in 2019, it was because they refused to let it vanish. The fire of memory they carried through those years became the spark that would reignite the investigation, and ultimately, uncover the truth that had been buried under New Mexico's desert silence. For 12 long years, Isabella's case sat in the shadows of the cold case files, a binder pulled down only on anniversaries or during fleeting reviews. Then, in early 2019, something shifted. The Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office, in partnership with the FBI, announced they would re-examine Isabella Morales' evidence using new technology. To the Morales family, it was the first glimmer of hope in over a decade. By that time, you had probably heard whispers of cases once thought unsolvable being cracked open by science. Across the country, stories surfaced of killers identified decades after their crimes, thanks to next-generation sequencing and genealogical databases. For families like Carmen's and Diego's, those headlines weren't just news, they were lifelines. The reopening began with a familiar but chilling ritual. In March 2019, evidence boxes from 2007 were pulled from storage under strict supervision. Investigators in gloves unsealed the bags, retrieving fragments that had been preserved for over a decade. Fingernail scrapings, fibers from Isabella's mint green shirt, the bracelet she wore that day. Each item was carefully repackaged for shipment to one of California's most advanced forensic labs. Next-generation sequencing, NGS, was the game changer. Unlike older methods that needed larger, cleaner samples, NGS could analyze even degraded fragments of DNA. It read genetic code like a puzzle, piecing together tiny shards until a profile emerged. For Isabella's case, it meant that the fight she left behind in those broken nails could finally speak louder than ever. Imagine being Carmen and Diego, sitting in a briefing room, watching the evidence being wheeled out. Each box was more than just a container. It was a piece of Isabella, frozen in time. Diego later said, It felt like they were carrying my sister's last voice out of that building. And in a way, he was right. By April, the California lab began running the tests. Machines hummed tirelessly, reading Isabella's killer's DNA one sequence at a time. Weeks passed, each day stretching like an eternity for the Morales family. Then came the call in late May. The results were in, but instead of triumph, there was heartbreak. Codice returned no matches. Once again, the killer's profile existed, but he was not in the national database. 17 years earlier, Isabella had clawed her attacker, embedding his DNA under her nails. Science had amplified that whisper into a clear genetic voice. Yet still, the system couldn't answer the only question that mattered. Who was he? For you, sitting with this story, it's easy to feel the gut punch the family felt. Imagine clinging to hope for 12 years, waiting for science to catch up, and then hearing, no match. In that silence, it would have been easy for investigators to shelve the case again, to slide Isabella's file back among the forgotten. But this time, they didn't. Instead, they turned to something more controversial, more powerful: genetic genealogy. You may recall the headlines when the Golden State Killer was unmasked in 2018. That same method, uploading crime scene DNA to commercial genealogical databases like GEDmatch, was now considered for Isabella's case. In June 2019, after tense legal arguments, a Bernalillo County judge signed an order granting investigators access. With it, they could upload the killer's genetic profile and search for distant relatives, not parents, not siblings, but cousins, second cousins, even fourth cousins. The idea was simple yet profound. If the killer wasn't in the system, maybe his family tree was. When the data was uploaded, results came back within hours. No close relatives, but a hit on a distant cousin in Texas. A woman who had voluntarily submitted her DNA for ancestry research unknowingly held the key to a buried murder case hundreds of miles away. From there, genealogists began the painstaking work of building a family tree. Birth records, marriage licenses, obituaries, and census data were layered together like a massive jigsaw puzzle. From one distant cousin, branches spread across New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Texas. Hundreds of names filled the chart. Imagine the cold case unit's office walls during those weeks. Whiteboards covered in red strings connecting names, photographs pinned beside census records, military draft cards taped alongside voter registrations. Piece by piece, investigators prune the tree. Too old. Too young. Lived too far. Died before 2007. Slowly, the branches narrowed. It was no longer a guessing game. For the first time since Isabella's death, the search was focused, precise. By late summer, fewer than 10 men remained on the list. All were of the right age, all with ties to New Mexico during the summer of 2007. Among them, one name would soon rise above the rest. But before that breakthrough, think of Carmen lighting her candle that year. For 12 years, the vigils had felt like echoes in the dark. In 2019, she spoke differently. Her voice was steadier. "They're looking again," she told neighbors gathered in Old Town Plaza. "This time, I believe they'll find him." Eights. For Diego, hope was sharper, edged with anger. He told reporters, "If someone fears their DNA being used to catch a killer, they've never lost a sister like I have." His words reflected the urgency that families of cold case victims feel, a desperation that outweighs debates about privacy. And so, while Isabella's portrait flickered in the candlelight, a team of genealogists and FBI agents traced her killer's bloodline across states and decades. It was a pursuit fueled by science, persistence, and the refusal to let her name vanish into cold case files. 17 years after Isabella was laid to rest, the walls of silence were finally beginning to crack. The next steps, surveillance, discarded evidence, and the unraveling of a seemingly ordinary man would bring the case to its most dramatic phase yet. If this part of Isabella's story moved you, let us know in the comments. Type 1 if you believe technology can finally give victims a voice, or 0 if you think justice here still came too late. By late 2019, the family tree had narrowed to just a handful of men, each falling within the right age range and each with ties to New Mexico. Investigators studied their movements, traced their past addresses, and compared them to known details from the summer of 2007. One man stood out. A construction worker who had lived less than 3 miles from the arroyo where Isabella had been found. His name was quietly added to the surveillance board. Detectives began the painstaking work of following him, observing his routines, and waiting for an opportunity to collect what they needed most: a fresh sample of DNA. The task was delicate. Any misstep could tip him off. Officers rotated shifts, trailing him to job sites, grocery stores, and local bars. The man seemed ordinary enough. He laughed with coworkers, chatted with cashiers, and returned home each evening to his modest apartment. Yet the file on the board painted a different picture. A man whose genetic profile, if tested, might unlock 12 years of silence. The breakthrough came in the most unremarkable way. One chilly October evening, after finishing a shift, the man stopped at a gas station convenience store. Surveillance teams watched from unmarked cars as he purchased a soda and a snack. Minutes later, he stepped outside, drank quickly, and tossed the aluminum can into a trash bin near the pump. The discarded can was retrieved within seconds. Gloves and evidence bags were ready. Under cover of darkness, it was secured, labeled, and transported to the state crime lab. There, forensic analysts swabbed the rim, searching for saliva left behind. The process took days, each one measured in tense hours. When the results returned, the impact reverberated through the entire task force. The DNA on the discarded can was an exact match to the profile found beneath Isabella Morales' fingernails in 2007. The chain of evidence, from the arroyo to the laboratory, was complete. The killer had been identified. With confirmation in hand, investigators moved swiftly. Warrants were secured, and surveillance intensified. The man, once just another face in the city, was now under a microscope. Detectives noted his solitary habits, his occasional bursts of anger, his tendency to retreat into silence when confronted. Former acquaintances were quietly interviewed, many describing a man who kept to himself, who rarely spoke about the past, and who sometimes seemed haunted by shadows only he could see. As the investigation deepened, fragments of his life began to unravel. Financial troubles, disciplinary issues at work, and a string of broken relationships surfaced. Each detail painted the picture of someone carrying a burden too heavy to conceal. The discarded can had not only exposed his DNA, it had torn open the facade he had carefully maintained for over a decade. By the end of 2019, the case file had transformed from a binder of dead ends into a living, breathing prosecution. Detectives who had once stood helpless in a dusty arroyo now prepared for the moment they could place handcuffs on the man Isabella had fought with her last breath. The match from the discarded can electrified the task force. Years of frustration collapsed into a single moment of certainty. The DNA found beneath Isabella's fingernails in 2007 belonged to one man, a construction worker who had lived unnoticed in Albuquerque's sprawl for over a decade. He had walked free while the Morales family carried the weight of absence. Now, the science had closed the distance. The arrest came quietly, without spectacle. Detectives surrounded his apartment at dawn. Neighbors peered from behind curtains as officers led him away in handcuffs, his face drawn, his silence unbroken. For many in the community, it was the first time they had ever seen him, yet his name spread through local headlines with a force that felt both inevitable and surreal. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was hushed but electric. Carmen and Diego sat side by side, holding hands tightly as the suspect was led into the hearing room. The man avoided eye contact, staring at the floor, shackled at the wrists and ankles. Prosecutors laid out the evidence. The DNA beneath Isabella's nails, preserved for 12 years, the surveillance operation, the soda can retrieved in silence. Piece by piece, the puzzle assembled into a story that could no longer be denied. For the Morales family, the confirmation was both devastating and relieving. Devastating, because the details of Isabella's final moments were laid bare once again, each bruise and scratch recounted in the sterile language of forensic reports. Relieving, because after so many years of unanswered questions, the circle of doubt had finally closed. They now knew who had taken her life. Reporters filled the hallway outside the courtroom, broadcasting updates across the city. Albuquerque watched as a story that had haunted it for more than a decade finally reached its reckoning. Parents who had once lit candles in the plaza stood outside, holding photographs of Isabella, whispering prayers of thanks that her voice had finally been heard. The closure hearing was brief, procedural in tone, but its impact was immense. The judge confirmed the evidence was sufficient to proceed to trial. In that moment, the cold silence that had surrounded the case for 12 long years cracked wide open. The city that had mourned Isabella now watched as justice, though delayed, finally took form. When the gavel struck, Carmen closed her eyes and whispered her daughter's name. Diego pressed his forehead to his palms, tears spilling silently. Around them, supporters placed gentle hands on their shoulders. It was not victory, not yet. But it was a promise that Isabella's fight had not been in vain. The Rio Grande shimmered in the fading light, its waters carrying secrets past the city that had waited so long for answers. At dusk, Carmen and Diego stood by the riverbank where Isabella's memory lingered. The sky burned orange, then softened into purple shadows, as if the desert itself was exhaling after years of silence. You imagine standing there too, the wind brushing your face, the water moving endlessly forward. Justice had come late, but it had come. Isabella's voice, trapped in silence for over a decade, finally rose through science, persistence, and love. Her story became more than tragedy. It became testimony that no shadow is permanent, no secret buried forever. As the candles flickered across the plaza that night, the city remembered. And you, watching now, are part of that remembrance. Because every time her name is spoken, every time her story is heard, she is not forgotten. If Isabella's story reached you, let us know. Comment 1 if it moved you, or 0 if you think we could tell it better. And if you want more stories where the forgotten find their voice, subscribe to the channel and ring the bell, because some truths still wait in the dark.